Okay, hopefully this sticks this time. Talking now. So I called it Know Thyself because the theme is basically how to have a better understanding of your own biases and flaws in your decision making in order to improve how you actually make decision making in teams. So I think knowledge is power in that aspect. So who I am currently a product manager at BAE Systems commercial wing, which is called Applied Intelligence. Doing threat analytics and also some analytics work generally. I was previously a co-founder of Hyperlane, which is a cybersecurity startup in the mobile security space. And then I started my career actually doing M&A for information security, so on the finance side. And I want to make defense sexy again, but as per the conversation at the happy hour, or I guess it was dinner last night, it's questionable if defense was ever sexy, so it may just be making it sexy in the first place. So what I'm going to cover, I'll try to be quick, but there's a lot to cover. So first, an overview of cognitive biases. I've talked on this before, so I posted those slides online, so if you want to learn more, feel free to look at those. And then digging into group dynamics, because no one is, or hopefully not a one-person security team at the company. You're working with some other team members, even if it's not directly in security, so that's important to keep in mind. And then strategies to counter the biases, and then kind of the overall, here's your checklist for what to do. So cognitive biases. So basically we have a lizard brain that makes us think somewhat irrationally a lot of the time. So the ideal is, the Homo economicus, someone that makes perfectly rational, self-interested decisions. We're, keeping in mind all the potential variables and outcomes when making a decision. But in reality, we actually mostly use our irrational brain, which is fine-tuned by evolution, as I say, to make speedy decisions to help you survive. So flight or fight responses, prioritizing the short term over the long term, because you might not actually be around. You might get eaten by like a tiger or something. So it's all part of this brain that isn't necessarily adapted to the modern way we have to do things. We don't objectively evaluate input is really the big problem. And we also create our own subjective realities, which obviously makes objective reasoning difficult. So prospect theory is kind of what I call the OG theory in behavioral economics. So it was in the 70s, it basically launched the field of behavioral econ because it started looking at how people empirically make decisions. So it has a ton of implications. These are some of the main ones. So you care about relative outcomes rather than objective ones. So you have this kind of reference point that you set for this is my status quo, and then you make decisions based on whether that's above or below that rather than looking at, okay, this objectively increases me by this much. So I'll get into kind of what the implications are in the next slide. But in general, it means you prefer like a smaller chance of a larger chance of a very small gain because you know that at least I'll be getting that. But for losses, you actually want to make riskier decisions. Because if you started here and you're down here, you want to try to jump back up as much as possible, even if it's less likely to let you do so, rather than just moving up a little bit. Losses, at least empirically, the theory is it hurts 2.25 times more than gains feel good. You overweight small probabilities and underweight big ones. Obviously, you can imagine this is a huge problem in InfoSec. And then you also have diminishing sensitivity to losses or gains as you move up and down. So offense versus defense, this is my, at least, thinking on how it manifests. So offense is in the domain of gains, which is a very established thing within prospect theory. So generally you're risk averse. Once you have that gain, you don't want to move back down, so you're less likely to make risky decisions. You more quickly update your reference point. You have a better feedback loop to figure out, okay, my status quo has now jumped up here. You also focus more on probabilistic versus absolute outcomes. Again, it's that certainty factor. But for defense, you're in the domain of losses, which means you're risk-seeking. You're slower to update the reference point, so you'll still think the status quo is up here rather than down here. And you'll also focus on the absolute versus probabilistic outcome. Again, trying to make that big leap up to where you think you were before rather than making incremental progress to get there. So my theory is that defenders overrate small probability attacks like the advanced or APT attacks and underweight common ones like phishing. I think everybody here knows phishing is still absolutely a scourge of enterprise information security, and people don't really focus on that as much. Defenders also prefer a slim chance of a smaller loss or getting a gain, like stopping a heart attack, because generally you don't think that you'll be able to stop Mossad. So if you do, then obviously that would be a big jump as far as confidence and abilities. So attackers also avoid harder targets and prefer repeatable, repackageable attacks. So I go into it a little bit on what Dino Dizovi called attacker math, but basically attackers always want to use whatever the easiest entry point is, even if they have something bigger in their arsenal, because they are risk averse. So some other biases to keep in mind. So time inconsistency is one of them. If you've heard of the marshmallow experiment, where it's basically letting little kids have one marshmallow now, or if they wait 10 minutes having two, the vast majority of people fail that. So we don't want to do things that have a delay to the reward. And this is really technical debt in a nutshell. It's like, well, we need to get this done. Even if long-term it'd be worth the investment, people tend to prioritize the short-term. Also, the cat and mouse game, it means you're more focused on block and tackling, being reactive, firefighting, all that, rather than making investments in resiliency in the future. Dual system theory, it's basically that we have two sorts of brains. The first one is what I'd call the lizard brain. Again, it's automatic, it's fast, it's unconscious. Mind system 2 is more of the rational, almost like Greek, controlled and slow and conscious. We'd ideally want to make decisions with system 2, but most of the time we make it with system 1, particularly when there's pressure, you're busy, things like that. So I argue system 1 is what leads to flashy demos, sexy word salads, known strategies and products, and then caring about ego and succumbing to FUD and fear of, most people who work on the defensive side would be worried about getting fired in event of a breach. That obviously has a big impact. So some of the outcomes as far as actual tools used, I have a list here of what I think are criminally under-adopted tools as a result. As you can see, the list isn't necessarily what we think of as sexy technologies on the defense side, but they are ones that have a really big impact on some of the common attacks, but even it scales up to the higher level attacks. And then over-adopted tools, I guess it could be controversial, but I would argue prevention isn't necessarily the right way to think about things. Focusing only on the delivery stage on the kill chain is another thing. Short-sightedness, uncontextualized threat intel, which again seems to be motivated more by emotion than by rationality. And then anything on the dark web, again, it sounds really cool, but really what's the impact to most people? For fraud, it can have a decent use case, but in general, I think it's very overhyped. So my analogy is it's like having lots of firefighters in a concrete door with a heat sensor, lots of information on how fires can be started, but you have entirely wooden furniture inside and open windows and no smoke alarms. So it's not necessarily the right way to build things. So an outcome, there's a great comic that is defunct I would love to bring back called Infostuff. As you can see, the guy is lamenting the fact that we keep getting owned by the exact same techniques and we aren't actually doing anything that meaningfully improves security. We're just kind of on this treadmill right now. So the incentive problems, one big outcome of this is that defenders have a really hard time evaluating their current position and figuring out where they are, again, relative to the status quo, which is a problem because they can't accurately evaluate their risk level or probabilities and impacts of attack. Defenders only really feel pain in the instance of a massive breach. Again, it's that not being sensitive to kind of smaller losses as you go down. You have to have kind of a big leap down, and that's what causes the oh shit moment when you call IR and everything. Attackers mostly can calculate their position. Their weakness, though, is they feel losses 3 times harder than the defense. So that's something that's actually really empowering. And also the high-stakes nature of the job, just to keep in mind for defenders, it facilitates more of the lizard brain thinking than system 2. So group dynamics, so that was all, most of the studies have been done on individuals. Just in the field of behavioral econ in general, there needs to be more work on how people make decisions in groups. But there is a little research at least to start. So it really is up for debate because there isn't a consensus yet on whether groups act more rationally or not. There's the potential that over time groups can actually learn better than an individual, which kind of makes intuitive sense. But there are also a lot of cognitive biases that are inherent in groups that are good to keep in mind. So also realistically, as I said, InfoSec is about teams rather than individuals, so it's important to have this group point of view. So a leader, just in general, creates really new social issues. So obviously people want to probably agree with their leader, particularly some leaders are very punishing if you don't agree with them. So if you're a leader or a manager or boss, you state your preference beforehand, people are more likely to go with that. Also, there's some evidence that groups have a stronger escalation of commitment, which is the doubling down effect. So basically, think about it like a feedback loop where if you've been pursuing one strategy, it doesn't necessarily work. Are you really going to be the person that's like, well, we just invested, say, $1 million in this project, but it's not working, so now we need to do something else. Like it takes, I guess, a certain level of gall, but also, again, a slight departure from how people typically behave in order to actually do that. So again, the term groupthink exists for a reason. It's also easy when you start hearing other people's reasons to kind of start questioning maybe a dissenting point of view. And also groups are even better at self-justifying their decisions, which is obviously a huge problem. You can retroactively think like, oh, well, this was the right decision because of X, Y, Z, and in groups it's even more so because you have less control in the situation since it was a group decision, so you're even more removed from like the responsibility aspect, which obviously is a problem. So as far as studies, anonymous cooperation has been shown to be the closest to rational, but in the studies where they've shown kind of free communication, you know who your teammates are, it's not that different than individuals. So I would argue most of the prior biases I talked about apply as well. So bosses cause a lot of problems. So having a boss gives you an awareness that your skill level is being evaluated basically at all times. So the big problem here, a lot of it is in framing, but think about it as if you're making a gamble, if there's a high probability that the gamble will pay off and you lose the bet, then you're probably going to look incompetent, and vice versa. If it seems like, oh yeah, it's very unlikely someone will win at this, and you do, you'll seem great. So risky decisions make subordinates appear more competent. The expectation of failure means that it looks better if it succeeds, and then there's really no penalty if it doesn't. And then the fear of being incompetent, obviously if there's an expectation of success, you look incompetent if it doesn't pay off, and you don't really get any benefit if it does pay off. So what it results in is that team members oftentimes feel like they can't actually refuse a decision from their superiors because it could appear to be a lack of belief in their own abilities or lack of confidence. Is bad. So as an example, security org split, this is probably a bigger organization, but you have your CISO and then you have different kind of security functions underneath them. Generally there will be managers and then it's reasonably flat underneath that, but obviously lots of different roles. But the setting is that CISOs overlook the managers. Everybody in the organization wants to cover their ass. They're first in line to be blamed. I think we all know this. Also, no one will ever get security 100% correct, so you're first to be blamed, and you know that it's not like you'll never ever have an incident. It's kind of a problem. Also, it's viewed as a cost center in most places. I know some people are trying to change that mentality, but that's going to be really slow because it's very hard to tie it to revenue. And then non-managers often become box minders regardless of role. They're just, again, configuring different security technologies rather than thinking strategically about how to meaningfully improve their security. So how are CISOs evaluated? Because this is obviously important because then it flows down to everything. So it's actually more in reducing costs, delivering projects on time, and then increasing efficiency, and then also the side thing of minimizing the company's risk profile, which you could also argue that part of that is being able to be a scapegoat in the event of an incident. But it's also the ability to sell the vision and communicate with the rest of the leadership within the company, which is really important. They're also responsible for managing any security incidents, both during and after. Then oftentimes being a thought leader in the community is important, which you can debate the merits of that another time. So as far as success and failure for their boss, success, based on the things on the last slide, it's helping reduce costs, deliver on time, and then increasing efficiency. Failure is obviously a breach, but also increasing costs and slow delivery. Anything hindering the rest of the business is obviously a huge problem. So as I put it, defending against like a super sweet APT, like really advanced attack, there's that expectation of failure. So the ROI actually looks better. It's like a great case they can present to the board about how awesome they are. But defending against skitties and more basic attacks, there's an expectation of success, so the ROI looks worse. So improving security is often at odds with the other objectives. Since I don't have a lot of time, I'm going to skip through this. I think everybody knows the problems with being seen as a cost center. But basically, anything where it could be a long-term investment that would improve security, you're probably not going to do it. So a sample meeting, I'll just go to the current decision-making process from the people that I polled. It seems like it's putting out fires first and then looking into risk mitigation, so like emergency room plus first responders. It's reactionary versus proactive, ad hoc brainstorming, and so forth. So moving into decision trees and strategies, which is really the point of all this. So there's a thing called belief prompting, which it's kind of a newish thing and hasn't been covered too much. You basically want to, when you think about game theory, you want to increase the player's decision making by one step. I go a step further and say we want to see kind of like mapping out all the decision trees in order to really make a good security strategy. So the research has shown that asking decision makers for their beliefs about their opponents actually increases their ability to make decisions absolutely enormously. So most people tend to assume that their adversary or their opponent isn't actually rational, which is not true. So they're going to be rational to some extent. So for example, as far as how to think about an adversary, like there was something, I forget if Dave Itell said it or if it was in the Snowden documents, but if the NSA thinks their target is running HIDs, they won't actually throw an exploit. So that's something to think about when you're trying to implement technologies. And it's thinking about how they'll actually behave. So good attack teams, to keep in mind, it's how quickly they move laterally and exfiltrate data. So as far as like when you're modeling out decision trees, you're looking at the kill chain, you need to keep in mind all these steps and be thinking through each iteration of things. Then also theorize the probabilities of each branch's outcome, because that's going to help you figure out where to prioritize. So example belief prompting, as far as some questions. So it's just how do you think our adversary chooses their delivery method? What countermeasures do they anticipate? How will they react to those countermeasures? Which of our assets will attackers want? So basically for each move, what I've said is map out for the defense. How would attackers preemptively, like if they think that we're using this or if they see they're using this, what will they do instead? How will they respond to whatever we put in place? Then for the offense, what are the costs and resources? Again, O-Day is very, very expensive. They're less likely to use that, so you need to build that into your model. Then also the probability that they'll just conduct the move in general. So as I said, Dino has a great quote, attackers will take the least cost path through an attack graph from their start node to their goal node. That's good to keep in mind. So you basically want to guide them or terraform them towards whatever the hardest and most expensive path is, because hopefully they'll give up if it's too expensive. So some examples, I'll just go through the first one since there's not much time. So like, should we use antivirus or whitelisting? Antivirus obviously is a lot easier to implement than whitelisting, but on the whitelist, it adds a recon step of figuring out which applications are on the whitelist, which is important. AV, it requires modifying malware, but basically everyone does that. So you really have to look at the long-term cost and trade-off benefit rather than just step one. So an example progression, hopefully you can see this. Just to go through it quickly, it's showing exfiltration and basically like we implement DLP, okay, they'll use like some sort of arbitrary web server rather than through email. Then you require only the Alexa Top 1000, they'll smuggle it through a legit service. You block outbound direct connections, they'll use SSL to hide traffic. You man in the middle SSL and use analytics, they'll start slicing and dicing data through like Google Drive. And then you start using other analytics and so forth. So it's really thinking about how your decisions flow through to the other side's decision making. So this, so long term, I would love to create software to do this, but this is probably more of a whiteboard thing for now. But this is essentially how you want to model it. So this is an example of like a criminal group landing on some random server. I have the hashtag YOLO for if you do absolutely nothing, which unfortunately some people do. But then as you can see, over here, you go through like GR security is very, very effective. Obviously, it's also very effective at being annoying for users. But this starts guiding towards like, okay, now there's only a 2% chance of success. How can we make sure to guide them over here? Same thing over here. Obviously, YOLO isn't going to result in much, but you can see like anomaly detection. You can assign some sort of probability for how much you think it works. farther up the tree, making sure you have role separation, but really it's to illustrate like, here's first how we're going to make our move, what sort of defenses will we put in place, what are the options then the attacker has, and then from there basically, okay, now what do we do, what do they do, and modeling it down to, for example, they win if you don't have like role separation or tokenization in like a server that has a database on it. So that's really, as far as the example, what you're looking to do. And when you have this, you start creating a feedback loop, because that creates an audit trail basically of how you made your decision. So after an incident, you can actually go back and say like, okay, here, on the map is where we failed and what our assumptions were. It also is good, again, in that team decision making, you can start pointing out like, hey, the reason why I think maybe that we need to switch strategies is because here we assumed this, but as we saw, attackers are actually doing this. So really it's to start creating a feedback loop. You continually refine your model after each incident. It also mitigates the doubling down effect, because it'll be pretty obvious if like you can circle here, this is the thing that fails every time, you should probably change it up. For prioritization, so the defender's advantage is they know the home turf. So as I said, visualize the hardest path for attackers. So terraform it that way. Remember, attackers are risk averse, so the smaller the probability you can guide them on that path, the better. Since I'm almost out of time, so as the leader of the group, leaders shouldn't state biases beforehand. You need to solicit feedback in a way that doesn't make dissenters feel out of place. Ask for those long-term views of probabilities and costs, so you can allow for those longer-term projects that'll actually have a big payoff. Then also create, similar to the tree, like decision payoff matrices, including probabilities of attack and likelihood of occurring. As a boss, you have to frame things in the right way. So work with team members to map out probabilities of success or failure, kind of like in my map. You need to have a clear idea of what constitutes a success or failure, again, because people, when there's uncertainty, they're gonna feel like they're gonna look bad if they refuse a project, and discourage risk-taking to show off is a really big one. So here, I'm gonna post the slides, but here's basically the steps to this process. Hopefully you have the enlightened conclusion. And final thoughts, again, make defense sexy again. I think decision trees and applying some of these like cool game theory ideas would help with that. And it creates like a very almost scientific process for how you're evaluating your decision making and strategies. I believe understanding your weaknesses is really empowering. So the TLDR, state assumptions, estimate outcomes, and compare the actual results. Some further reading, I'm talking about more of the decision tree stuff in March. And then we have no time for questions, but you can either find me, email me, tweet me, or message me on LinkedIn. So thank you.